Hello and welcome to Lesson 17 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, in which we take you from absolute chess beginner to winning your first chess tournament games and beyond. And today we'll talk about chess openings for beginners. So, a lot of beginners they're not sure how to start a chess game, and I did have a video, a lesson previously about general chess opening principles, and you should always keep those in mind. Controlling the center, developing your pieces quickly, getting your king castle to safety, and all of that. But let's dig a little bit deeper and figure out, what should beginners be starting out with when they choose their first openings. Well, usually I would recommend starting out with white as e4 or with e4, because if we look at this database here of games, e4 and d4 are played quite a bit more often than any other first moves. So e4 is number one, and I would definitely recommend starting out with e4 as a beginner. Now there D4 and E4, the choice or the difference between those really depends on tactics. If you like tactics and attacking chess, you want to start out with E4 because the game usually opens up more, giving your pieces more room to attack. And even if you don't like tactics, you still need to learn and improve on tactics as a beginner. I would probably recommend your first few months, maybe 6 months, that you just stick with E4 openings, just until you improve on your tactics and you get used to attacking and defending against attacks. And then you could try D4. So let's see here if it lets me take that back. Let me reset this. Yeah, so then you could try d4, which leads more to strategic chess, maneuvering. A lot of times the center will be locked up and you'll have to maneuver around on the edges, on the sides of the board. The games can be a little more complicated. So to start with as a beginner, I would definitely recommend trying e4 out for a while. And, you could try some d4 games on the side, just to see what they feel like and compare the two. But I would definitely start out with e4, and most of your opponents are going to respond with e5 if they're beginners. Now, as you play, you'll start to see other responses. And when it comes to beginners and choosing openings, I wouldn't try and memorize too much, but pick one opening, we'll say e4, and then you could write down maybe on index cards or on your phone or somewhere, some way you could keep track, take screenshots or pictures of the different openings, but some way to keep track of what moves you choose against what your opponent will play. So e4, e5 is very common. And then you may say, well, what should I play after that? Well, you have a couple options. Probably the best move and the most played here is knight to f3. So I'd probably begin with that. Although, you could try other things just to experiment. You could try the King's Gambit, which is an interesting opening, which basically attacks immediately this pawn here. But it can be a little more dangerous right out of the opening until you figure out what to do and what not to do. But the idea behind the King's Gambit is usually you give up this pawn, but you're going to create an opening here. So let's see, the most played move is to just capture this pawn, and then white usually plays here to prevent the queen from coming in and harassing the king. And now, let's see. It looks like most often played is g5 here, threatening to attack the knight. And then, h4 is the most common move. But you could play bishop to c4 as well, the second most played move. And if we go back here, let's see if there are other responses. d5 or d6. So let's say your opponent plays a little passively and they just play d6. Well then, what should you do? You could immediately grab the center by placing both of your pawns there. And once again, it wants that g5 move. So we could play that, g5, and then it recommends h4, then g4 attacking the knight. And now knight to g1 is the most common move, so this is interesting. I'll play this out a little bit further just to see what the most common moves are. So bishop to h6, which, this guards this unprotected pawn, which now the bishop is attacking here. And then knight to c3, just developing. And then let's see, c6 to keep this knight from moving forward, and maybe to slow down this d pawn, because if knight to c6 was played, I guess one possibility could be to attack that knight in the future. But anyway, so it looks like knight at g to e2, and then the queen moving in here to help guard this pawn, and then let's see, g3 is played most often. So interesting stuff here. And then after capture, we have knight captures, then bishop captures, and now it looks like rook captures is most played here. And I'll play out a few more moves just to give you an idea of what could happen in this. So then the queen's developed, and I'm surprised this bishop has not come out, because a lot of times the bishop could come out to c4, and then if white castled kingside, there could be an attack on this f-pawn. But if we go back to the beginning and take a look at this one more time, e4, e5, and then f4 is the king's gambit. So most often played is to just capture, but of course they don't have to do that. So we could take a look at what happens if they don't capture. Well, it looks like d5 is played quite a bit, which is the Falkbeer counter gambit. So white was gambiting this pawn, but now black is offering up both of his pawns that could be captured by white here. So it looks like most often played is e takes d5, and then e4, pushing forward and gaining space in the center. And then white usually immediately attacks this pawn. Then the knight protects, capture, knight captures, knight to f3 to prevent any attacks by the queen on this diagonal, bishop to c5, black's turn, bishop to c5. So now there's a threat here. So what is played most often? Well, it looks like queen to e2, but you get the idea. A lot of attacking going on in these e4, e5 games. So one other thing, whether you like more attacking chess or strategic chess, even if you play e4, you can have one or the other depending on what opening you choose. So I'll take a quick look at some other openings here before this video drags out too long and we haven't really checked out many of the other openings. So e4, e5. Well, now we have knight to f3. So this is probably a good place to begin before you get into the crazy King's Gambit games. But, you could try those out for fun. So knight to f3. Most often played is knight to c6 here. Well, now it looks like bishop to b5 is played most, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. But, this is usually played by top players, masters, chess professionals, and it can be pretty complicated, all the different variations. And a lot of the variations have been studied and tested, out to like 20 or 30 moves and beyond. So this can probably be a little too complicated for a beginner. I mean, once again, you could try this opening and just see if you like it. There are different options here, and that's another thing that makes it complicated. Black usually plays a6 here, and then you could either capture the knight or you could retreat, which is played most often. And then black just develops. White usually castles here. Then both sides just continue development here. Let's see, b5 attacking the bishop. The bishop has to retreat. Then this move is played, letting the other bishop come out and possibly pin this knight. But also this bishop is kind of trapped here, so usually c3 is played in case the knight attacks the bishop, it can escape. And now castling h3 to prevent a pin on this knight that could be it could be a hassle to deal with if this bishop comes down here and pins this knight. But here this just avoids that. And then after this move, the bishop is able to retreat here, but it allows this pawn that was blocked by the knight to jump forward and help control the center. But white usually just moves here anyway. And now the most common played move is to just develop the queen to c7 here, and then just wait to see what white will do. So I'll just play a few more moves just to give you the idea, or give you an idea of what could be played. A common theme is to bring this knight up here, and then it can reposition here to f1, and then either go up to e3 or g3. I'll just play the most common moves. So capture, knight moving back here towards the center and attacking this pawn. And then, let's see, knight to b3 being played. And now a5 threatening to attack this knight. Bishop to e3. Helping guard the pawn. a4 just continuing to attack. And then the knight retreats to here. Bishop to d7. And you get the picture. White moves his rook here on this open file. The queen moves over to prevent any surprises up the c file. And then this knight finally moves over here, and then we have let's see, this, the knight can move up here, bishop to d8, and then from there I guess it can reposition here and attack the center. So queen developing, h6 to keep pieces out of the king side, and then let's see, rook at e to d1 now to help guard this pawn and attack up the center. So anyway, that gives you an idea of how the Ruy Lopez can go. And it's, a lot of complicated maneuvering chess. And, maybe you could try it out, but what I would recommend is after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. Instead of the Ruy Lopez, try out bishop to c4. So this is a good beginner opening that probably every beginner should learn and be at least a little familiar with this opening. So this is one choice you could try out. And the most common response is to just also bring out a bishop here. And we see the theme of this opening is to apply pressure to these f pawns because they're pretty weak, as the king is the only thing protecting them in the opening. So now white can either castle immediately here or play c3. Another common theme for white here is to play c3, which fortifies a d4 pawn push. And so then if this pawn captures, the c pawn could recapture, attacking the bishop, and then possibly jumping forward with the d pawn and chasing the knight away. But looks like knight to f6 is most common because white could also threaten to jump his knight up to g5 and attack the f pawn with the knight and the bishop. So now by moving to f6, black is counterattacking white's pawn and ready to castle here as well. So d3 is the most commonly played move to protect this pawn, but d4 has been played as well. So when you're picking or choosing your moves in the opening, a lot of it will depend on your preference. If you want a wilder attacking game, or if you want to play more safely, more conservative, that will help you determine whether to play something like d3, which just protects everything, or d4, which will start attacking, probably open the position up quicker. So it looks like d3 is played most often, followed by d6, and then white usually castles, and then a6, making an escape hatch for the bishop, and also allowing this pawn, the b pawn, to push forward and start attacking the bishop here on c4. So the bishop usually just retreats anyway, so the pawn can't chase it away. And then let's see, this bishop takes time to retreat, and now the other knight is developed. Black finally castles. h3 can be played to prevent a pin on this knight by the bishop when it develops, and so h6, kind of doing the same thing, although right now the knight is blocking this bishop, and then rook to e1, just putting the rook on the area where the pawn is pushed forward the most. If you have no open or half open files, then a lot of times it's a good idea to put your rook behind a pawn that is advanced forward, or keep it behind pawns that you plan to push forward. All right, so now we have the most played move being knight to h5, which allows this pawn to start pushing forward and attacking a more valuable central pawn with a less valuable pawn on the side. Of course, right now, this bishop is pinning this pawn to the king. So, I guess the other reason to jump here is to try and bring the knight into f4. And if it's attacked, it could jump back up here to the center. But let's see what happens. So now it looks like knight to f1 is most common. And also this knight, if it planned to jump here, now the knight could capture it. So that might be another reason to move the knight to the edge, because usually you do not want to keep your knights on the edge of the board. And now queen to f6, just maneuvering over to the king side here, which I guess if the knight is attacked now and the knight jumps forward, if the bishop would capture, the queen, instead of the pawn capturing, the queen could capture. Anyway, you get the idea. So now bishop to e3 is usually played, followed by, let's see here, knight to f4, and then knight to g3 here, g6. So you get the point. Both sides just develop their pieces, and there's more maneuvering. It doesn't get as crazy here with d3. Whereas with d4, the center probably would have opened and the game would be more tactical. All right, let me go back to the beginning. All right, so e4, e5. I would recommend starting out with knight to f3, and then if they respond with this, play the Italian game and just see where that takes you. So now, if we go back to the beginning, also with e4, you have to decide what to play against other openings. So it looks like the Sicilian defense is played most often. So here, you could once again just play knight to f3, and then the most common move is d6, and then you just jump forward with both of your pawns in the center. And then they're usually going to knock out one of those center pawns. You recapture. They attack your other pawn. You protect. And then the most common move is a6 to keep pieces out of this b5 square and to get ready to push this b pawn forward and gain space on the queen side. But there are many other moves that can be played. So you'll just have to experiment. But in the beginning, just know that if you play e4 and they play c5, just decide what your first move should be. You could start with knight to f3, but you don't have to do that. You could play knight to c3 as well, or even pawn to c3 to help fortify a d pawn push. So, as you see, there's so many variations that when you're starting out, I recommend you just pick, let's go back to the beginning, pick your first move. If you're a brand new absolute beginner, I would recommend just starting with e4 because there'll be more tactics and you definitely need to practice and learn tactical and attacking chess and how to defend as well. So e4 is a good start. And then you'll just have to figure out what response you want to play to black's different moves. So they could play c6, the Caro-Kann. And usually if they don't fight for control of the center immediately and they let you put both pawns in the center, that's almost always a good idea. So then now they usually play this to start fighting for the center. And you have an option here. You can defend with the knight, you can capture, or you could even push forward and gain space. If you want to keep things simple, you could just capture. They'll usually capture because if they capture with the queen, then you could chase their queen with your knight attacking that queen. So they'll usually capture with the pawn. And now we see that white has a half open e-file, and so they'll probably try to put a rook here and get play up this e-file in the center, and black will probably try and play down this half open c-file here with rooks and the queen possibly. But black is left with two center pawns to white's one. So another plan could be for white to push the c-pawn and attack this pawn. And in fact, that is the most common move in this position, is c4. So after this, it looks like knight to f6, then knight to c3, and we have something similar to, after e6, similar to a queen's gambit declined here, but without the center pawn and the c pawn. And I'll talk about the Queen's Gambit later because that's something as well that you may want to try out as a beginner. Knight to f3, and you get the picture. You want to develop your knights and then your bishops and get your king castle to safety. And I can't cover all these lines in this one video, so I'll just briefly touch on the different openings. So that was the Caro-Kann with e4, e4, and c6. And usually white just takes control of the center and black will counterattack, backed up by the c pawn and attacking the e pawn here. Another possible opening that black could play is the French defense here with e4, e6. And then white will usually once again try and take control of the center. And now we have this pawn pushing forward, counterattacking the e pawn again and backed up by the e pawn. So here the most common move is knight to c3, but knight to d2 can be played, or the pawn can push to e5 and gain space in the center, locking up the center. But that can be more complicated and lead to more maneuvering chess. So the most common move is this. And then here it looks like pinning the knight to the king is common. And now e5 can be played, or you can capture this pawn. So this is the most common move, followed by this move here. And so in the French defense, we see a common theme where there's a pawn chain here with this d pawn and e pawn, and they're pointing up towards the king side. And usually the direction that your pawns are pointing is usually the direction you want to move your pieces and attack towards, because you'll have more room for your pieces to maneuver there. So white wants to aim at the king side, black wants to aim at the queen side. And so the most common move is usually this. The bishop captures, white recaptures, and then we see a conflict here between the c pawn and the d pawn. But black doesn't usually capture here, or it will undouble white's weak doubled pawns here. So knight to e7 is most common. And now white can either attack with the queen being brought out early, or the second most played move is just to develop a knight. And then it looks like, let's see, either bishop development, or this knight could jump to here, putting more pressure on this d pawn. And now you get the picture. Play will revolve around the center. Right now it's all about this d pawn. But the French defense can involve more maneuvering. So this is another opening you'll have to be aware of and figure out what to do against it. And there are many other openings. So I can't cover everything, but before I end the coverage of e4, e5, I'll take a look at knight to f3, knight to c6, the most common move. So you either have bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game, bishop to c4, the Italian game, or the third most played move, d4 here, the Scotch game. So this is also another good opening that you can try out as a beginner. So here, when your opponent has the two pawns in the center, it's usually best to knock out that one of those pawns if you can, because if you don't, this pawn could push forward and chase your knight away, which is protecting this e pawn. So the most commonly played move is to capture here. And then it looks like most common is just a recapture. So you could play knight captures. You could, if you like to play gambits and more daring chess, you could play bishop to c4, the Scotch gambit. But I won't go into all that because I don't have enough time. So we'll just play the main moves. Knight captures. Then it looks like the other knight usually develops. And usually don't want to move a piece twice in the opening. But this is the most played move here. And remember, there are exceptions. And now, capturing towards the center is played most often. Because if you capture away from the center with the D pawn, then there's a possibility that your opponent could just trade off queens. And that depends on you, whether you mind trading off queens or not. But if we play the most common line, it looks like the B pawn usually captures. So black is left with this weak isolated A pawn, but he has an extra pawn that helps cover important central squares. And so normally here E5 is played, and then queen to E7, pinning the pawn to the king, preventing the capture of the knight. And then the pin is broken, renewing the threat on the knight here. And now knight to D5, and then C4 is most common, attacking the knight. But now the most common move is this, pinning the pawn to the queen here, so that knight can't be captured. Well, then and also this pawn is under attack, so normally it is protected. And then we have this move, preparing to bring the bishop over here and add more pressure to this pawn in the center. So F4 to protect the pawn, bishop develops, queen. Now looks like queen to F2 is played most often. So pretty interesting that would be played. What can that allow? I guess it would let you get your bishop out and get ready to castle. So queen to F2, knight moving away here because it was under attack. So let me go back and take a look at that. If we go back, all right. So it renews the attack on the knight. So that's why the queen moves away, so the bishop can't capture the queen, and now this pawn is threatening to just capture here. So the knight moves to B6, and then bishop to A3, attacking the queen here and preventing kingside castling. So the queen usually moves up, and then the other knight is developed. And now D6, threatening to break open the center, and also get rid of this E pawn. And then there's an attack on the rook, and white needs to castle yet. So it looks like the most common move here is queenside castling. And so now this rook will try and take control of this open file if this pawn captures here. And now kingside castling. And we could have an exciting game from here where this opponents have castled on opposite sides, and then they can use their pawns to storm each other's position because the pawns the kings are on opposite sides, and you don't have to worry about weakening your king because you can move the pawns on the opposite side and attack your opponent. All right, so that was the Scotch game. I'll take a quick look at the D4, D5 pawn openings. So the second most played move is D4. So this can lead to D5, and we could go into the Queen's Gambit with C4 like this. So D4, D5, C4 attacking this central pawn, daring black to capture the c-pawn, pulling its more valuable central pawn away from the center. But here either e6 or c6 are played quite often. And we'll just take a look at this, e6. The queen's gambit declined here. The queen's gambit accepted would be if you capture that c-pawn. So here we have knight to c3, developing this knight, putting more pressure on this d5 pawn. And the most common response is to just protect the pawn in the center, and then now capturing is most common. So you could go ahead and capture in the center and release some of the pressure here building up, or you could continue to add pressure, developing, pinning this knight to the queen. The pin is broken, developing the bishop. Then e3 is played to help bolster the d-pawn and get ready to develop this bishop. And so now we have, let's see, castling. Knight develops, h6, chasing the bishop away. The bishop usually retreats, and then looks like b6. So this bishop is kind of a troubled, bad bishop blocked in by its own pawns. So it may develop to b7 or even to a6 to put pressure on this c-pawn. So bishop to d3 is usually played, and then bishop to b7, castling, and finally the other knight is developed. And we could go a few more moves. Queen develops, this c-pawn pushes forward, the rook moves over here to help bolster the center, the knight can jump forward, and now this bishop is under attack. So it could capture up here, but it looks like the most common move is this, and then the knight captures, capturing towards the center with the pawn. So maybe later you could get some kind of play up this h-file, but not at the moment, of course. And then let's see, capture, knight captures, knight develops, and finally the rook here, and bishop attacking. So this gives you an idea of how the game can play out. And the queen's gambit declined. And one other thing after d4, you also have to prepare what to play against this possible move. So here you can't develop your e-pawn, but you could develop the c-pawn to help control the center. And then the most commonly played move is either e6, second is g6. So these are the kind of moves you'll have to look at. But once again, knight to c3, maybe bishop pinning the knight. The queen jumps over here to help protect the knight. That way, if it's captured, he doesn't have to double up his pawns. Black can already go ahead and castle. And this is the Nimzo Indian defense. So something else that you may have to play against. So a3, forcing this bishop to make a decision. And usually it captures. Queen captures. And then the other bishop can be developed over here. Pinning of the knight to the queen. Bishop develops. And then f3 is played most often, which keeps the knight out of here. It blunts the scope of this bishop down through the diagonal towards the king side, and it allows this e-pawn to push up to e4. So h6, attacking the bishop retreats, and then we have d5, finally fighting in the center. e3, just fortifying this d-pawn, and then the knight can develop. The c-pawn captures the more valuable central d-pawn. Knight captures, attacking the queen. But we have queen capture and queen capture, so they trade off queens. And now the bishop retreats, and the knight retreats as well. So this is just an idea of how things can go in the Nimzo Indian. And there are so many openings. That's why, as a beginner, I recommend you focus on keeping general opening principles in mind. So control the center by pushing your pawns into the center where they attack squares in the center. And then also develop your pieces, your knights first usually because they're slow, and attack the center. And then your opponent will have to protect this pawn. And then one other opening you could try out is to just develop your knights. You could have something like this, the 3 knights opening, and now the 4 knights game. And then the most common move is to develop the bishop to attack this knight. And they do the same. And then you're ready to castle. They castle. And now you can play d3 to help fortify the central pawn. They do the same. And now the other bishop is developed, pinning this knight. And then here, finally, some pieces are traded. So the queen can develop, the rook develops, and then the knight can retreat away to here, and now this pawn can chase the bishop away. So d4 is played, attacking in the center, and then we have this knight moving up to a better position and attacking the bishop. So the bishop retreats, c5, attacking the center, and now this bishop retreats. So interesting that these bishops have retreated back. And now rook to d8, preparing to line up on the queen. The most common move looks to be g3. And then queen to c7. d5 attacking the knight. Knight to f8. Knight to h4. h6. f4. Knight to g6 attacking our knight. And then, either pushing forward with the pawn, daring you to capture, or you could go ahead and capture. But anyway, that is the 4 knights game, another possible opening to be aware of. All right, this was just to give you a taste of different beginner openings you can try. I would recommend you just pick one. You could try different ones, see if you like them, and then just pick one and stick with it for a while and try and learn all the ins and outs by playing a bunch of games with that opening. All right, everybody. I hope you had a enjoyable experience going over these different openings. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions, and also if you have any requests, you can leave them as well, and I'll try to get to them when I can. Thank you for watching, everyone, and have a super chess day.